We would like to welcome you to our Zooming in for 2021 Spring Gardening. And tonight we have Pruning Trees and Shrubs. And our guest speaker presenter is Mike Mahana. He's been involved in the Oneida County Master Gardener Program since 2003. He is a New York certified arborist and serves as a regional urban forestry program committee on relief. The committee is overseen by DEC in partnership with the New York State Urban Forestry Council, which is a non-for-profit advisory group. We would like to involve more people in the community about urban forestry. And tonight we are recording the session, and please use the question and answer to put your questions in, and Mike will answer them at the end of the presentation. And I will let Mike begin. Thank you, Mike.
Okay, thanks, Holly. Let me get my presentation up. Okay. Everybody see Mr. Bear?
We do.
All righty. So welcome, everyone. Thanks for the introduction. And thanks for Linda for helping set this up, and her son and my daughter. You know, you have to get the young ones in there with the technology. So modern day pruning. So pruning really should begin in the design process. If you're doing a new landscape design, this is a property that we redid the landscape, and before we redid it, there were two 50-foot blue spruce trees in this front lawn, and that's all there was. Of course, we don't want to plant blue spruce trees on the foundation of a property. But with that being said, during the design process, know the plants you're putting in, know what they grow to, and that's really going to reduce your pruning that you need to do. If you put the right plant in the right place during your design process, you'll need to do very little pruning. So this is another design that we did, and these plants are all at their mature size. The flowering crab in the center is a coral burst flowering crab, which is a dwarf species. Now we have to remember, in the plant kingdom, dwarf is 11 feet. So, you know, the plant label, of course, is going to give you all the information you need also. But this spanse was over 30 feet. And as you can see, we only have 7 plants in that 30-foot spanse. Here's another design install that we did. Again, you know, taking into consideration what the plants are going to grow to. The gray plant you see in the foreground is Russian sage, then some ornamental grasses, some 9-bark, and some evergreens. And the tall, narrow tree is a European hornbeam. Now, I apologize in advance if any of these pictures show anyone's house. That has happened in the past, but this was a home that I drove by, and you see there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 hemlock trees. Hemlocks mature at about 110 feet. So not a great choice to put on your foundation. They've got a couple weeping trees in there, some hidden rhododendrons underneath the hemlock. So again, know your plants and what they grow to, because obviously this plant here, planting needs a lot of maintenance, a lot of pruning just to keep it intact. Plus, there's a lot of moisture being held around the foundation of the house because no wind or air can get back there because of the overplanting. Okay, so reasons for pruning. So we prune to remove cross, dead, or irregular branches. So if you look at some of your plants, the photo on the left is a rubbing branch, you would move that. Bottom right-hand corner is a weeping mulberry. So all weeping trees are grafted onto regular tree stock. So this weeping mulberry is grafted onto the stock of a mulberry tree. So in reality, this weeping tree wants to really be a mulberry. So you'll get this upward growth genetically that will come out of the plant that you'll need to prune off. And then the upper right hand shows a dead branch growing off the side of the tree. We prune to train the plant. This is an ESPALIER, Granny Smith apple tree, growing on the side of one of my clients' homes. We also prune to maintain healthy plants. Now, if you look closely at this picture, you can see little black knots or black formations on the tree. So this is a snow cloud flowering cherry, Canadian cloud, and they're susceptible to black knot. So I never understood, and plus this is during non-winter scenes. This is in a parking lot, so it's supposed to be a shade tree, but yet they chose to shear it into a Q-tip. So there you have it. In reality, this tree should probably be pruned right at the bottom, ground level, removed, and replaced. We also prune to improve the quality of flowers, fruit, foliage, or stems. This is the same as ESPALIER, the Granny Smith apple. And you can see the apples growing on the tree there. And then later on in the lecture, we'll talk about pruning fruit trees, standard fruit trees. Then we also prune to restrict growth, as in this hedge here, keep it off the walkway and to keep it intact. And we also prune to rejuvenate and restore old plants. A lot of deciduous shrubs lend themselves to rejuvenation. This is a burning bush, which we cut right back to the ground. You can see in the lower part of the picture the stems from the original plant. And then all of these 18 to 20 inch long stems are growing from the rootstock. And that's 1 year's growth. We cut that late winter, and that was that summer's growth from the rejuvenation. So we have to talk a little bit about a fellow named Alex Shigo. Mr. Shigo is on the right with the camera around his neck. He was pretty much the godfather of tree pruning, and he worked for the U.S. forestry system for over 25 years. And in traveling through the woods, he would notice that a branch like the one that you're seeing now would die back naturally, fall off, and then would heal itself. That wound would grow over what he called compartmentalize and secure the decay. So what Shigo did was he started dissecting trees lengthwise, opening them up to see what was going on inside from the current pruning practices. So what he found was when arborists and tree care people were making flush cuts, so a flush cut is cutting close to the trunk. There was no way for that tree and that cambium to grow over and compartmentalize and stop that decay from spreading. So you can see here in the photos where the decay is exposed to the air, it will continue to spread up and down, which will create a weak juncture in the tree. And this is a flush cut. Now, I was in college in 1982. They were teaching flush cuts. It was during that time when SHIGO'S started promoting the new method of pruning, to where, because in the old days, they would just flush cut it and then paint it with the white paint, which had no healing properties whatsoever. And this decay from these flush cuts would keep spreading down through. So SHIGO'S discovery was to prune at the branch collar. And by pruning at the branch collar and the branch bark ridge, that cambium would grow over and compartmentalize that wound and stop the decay from spreading. So to make the proper cut, first you would undercut the limb at about 9 to 12 inches, depending on the diameter of the limb you're cutting. The larger the limb, the closer you would cut it back. The smaller limb, you can go 9 to 12 inches out. So you would undercut it, and we're underscoring it to prevent the cambium and the bark from ripping. So this is what we're trying to prevent by undercutting. So we would undercut, then we would top cut and remove all of that weight off of the limb. And then once all of that weight is removed, then we would do our finish cut right at the branch bark ridge. Now these pictures I took 19, 20 years ago. When I first started doing presentations. So that's the cut, the final cut right at the, you can see where it's rippled. So that's the branch bark ridge. And that's what it looked like 7 years later. Now this is a mature maple tree. So trees like humans heal slower when they're older, faster when they're younger. The older trees, their metabolism is slowing down and it takes longer to heal. So this was a mature tree. So it did take a little longer to heal. And this picture was 10 years after. It hasn't quite compartmentalized yet, but you can see if you made the proper cut down the road as that cambium grows, it should look like a bagel or a donut type shape around the wound, because we're basically creating wounds anytime that we're pruning trees. So that's what you should see as the tree progresses. And here's a cut that I made on a flowering crab tree. And this is getting pretty close to compartmentalizing. So let's talk a little bit about pruning shade trees. This is an actual person's shade tree in the city of Rome. I watched these trees for years driving by this gentleman's property. He hand pruned these trees with a pole pruner, painstakingly, limb by limb. And I give the guy credit. You know, it really takes a while to create this. But, you know, yes, the trees do look healthy, but they are stunted in growth, which again is not detrimental to the tree. But it's a lot of work, and this is more of a European style of pruning that you see in Europe. So what we're looking at when we do prune shade trees, so if you look at the picture on the right, where there's the figure of a person on the lower left. So that's a newly planted tree, and all the branches on that newly planted tree are temporary branches. They're just going to aid in developing the root system and food storage in the early years. So the tree on the far lower right is 5 to 10 years later. And what you're going to do is you're going to shorten the temporary branches by raising the crown of the tree. And you'd always like to go minimum 6 to 7 feet. You want to have good head clearance for anybody in the yard, mower clearance if you have a mower with a rollover bar on it. So you always want to, and again, that's depending on variety. If you have a columnar oak tree, English oak, that grows from the bottom, but they're also narrow. So what you would do in that instance is bring the mulch ring out a little farther around the base. But for the standard maple shade tree, you're going to shorten those branches and raise the crown. And the top half is going to be the permanent canopy. And then the center picture is within the next 30 or 40 years. Again, you'll take the lowest scaffold off in the second scaffold, and you'll thin out any irregular growth, water sprouts, broken branches, dead branches, and sucker growth, as you see in the picture in the left. So this is a maple tree that I planted on my property. And this was born out of, you can see on the right where there's a little parking spot. So we created that turnaround. And as I dug it out, I put the dirt to the left in a big pile, and I had no way to move it. So I was like, oh, I'll level it out, and it'll be an ideal spot for a shade tree. So this tree I planted, it was a young little whip, probably 5, 6 years old. These were the early prunes that I made when it was 5 to 6 years old. And these have totally compartmentalized. The cambium has totally grown over and healed that wound. And that's the following year, because as every year I would raise the canopy of the tree as we spoke in the previous slides. And then in the third year, again, raising the canopy, and you can see in the middle prune that cambium is just starting to grow over. And that was a current year prune, just an example of the branch bark ridge where you would prune to. Now here's a tree growing. This is in Rome, and city tree owned by the city. Most trees between the walk and the road are city property. But like most cities, they don't have money for aftercare. They have the money to plant the trees, but not the money for the aftercare. So this maple tree is at an intersection. When it is in leaf, you really can't see the sign that says deaf child area. And a lot of these lower limbs should be removed, and this crown should be raised, because within another 2 to 3 years, those branches will be growing into the sidewalk. Then you can see where someone made an attempt on the first 2 lower branches to cut them off, those stubbed cuts. Obviously, they should be cut back to the branch collar. You've got one branch, as you can see here, starting to wrap around and rubbing against another branch. So in reality, these bottom 4 branches start there with removing those 4 branches. I took this photo in a shopping center parking lot. They had planted, when they built the shopping center, they planted the grass islands, put shade trees, hoping that, you know, everyone looks for the shady spot in the parking lot. But the landscape contractor who had this contract was looking for more ways to make a few bucks than mowing the islands, and went through and topped all the shade trees, which they're going to have a difficult time to survive. One of my favorite slides here. Topping is for ice cream, not trees. So tree topping, a harmful pruning practice in which tree branches are cut to stubs to reduce the size of the tree. Here, this tree is growing around here in Clinton, where I live, a weeping willow growing in a horse pasture. You know, willows are very messy. They drop a lot of limbs, a lot of branches. So this homeowner decided to try to reduce it. And in actuality, it's doing more harm than good, because where they had topped the branches, now you're going to get sucker growth or branch growth from the cuts, which are going to be attached to live and dead wood. So as those branches mature, they're going to easily snap from that juncture and fall off. You know, willow to begin with is a very brittle tree. That's why they lose so many of their branches. You know, they grow fast, and with that being said, they're very brittle, very messy tree. Again, one of my favorite photos. So there actually is a study that was done that determined asphalt that is in the shade of a large tree lasts up to 60% longer, because the UV rays are not breaking down the properties of the blacktop. This also was in a parking area. I want to think that they were going to remove the tree for some reason. Really hard to believe that someone would prune that like that. I wouldn't be surprised. I've seen worse, but that looks to be like a pin oak. It's casting a little bit of shade in the corner of the parking lot there on the left, but definitely not enough to benefit anyone. So again, a prime example of topping. This is a practice that's called lion's tailing, where a lot of the lower and middle branches are cleaned out or pruned out. So what happens now is you have this big tuft of foliage at the end of the limb, and you get a heavy wind, and that wind will whip that tuft or sail, as you would, of leaves and branches back and forth, which could definitely cause some breakage and snapping. So lion's tailing is a very dangerous pruning method, because the tree is bound to fail. So let's talk a little bit about ornamental trees. So ornamental trees roughly grow anywhere from 8 to 18 feet. That's the range of an ornamental. This is a picture of a Washington hawthorn variety, Crimson King. Obviously looks fantastic in the winter with the red berries. That's my favorite attraction of this tree. A lot of my designs, I try to incorporate plant material that's going to look good in winter. Fortunately, I enjoy the winter. I love the change of the season. So I tried to accept it and design for it so the landscaping looks good year round. And actually, I planted this tree. This is up at Hamilton College. I had a 20-year career at Hamilton as an arborist and an horticulturalist, and planted probably around 700 to 750 trees during my time at the college. And this is one of them. So let's talk a little bit about how to position your pruning shears when you're pruning a branch or a shrub, mainly a branch on a tree. Shrub, it's not as detrimental. So you always want to make sure that you have the blade to the trunk side. So you can see in the lower left, the blade is against the trunk. So you're going to prune right at that branch collar. So you can see on the picture on the right, if you have what's called the hook on the trunk side, you're going to leave that little bit of a stub, which down the road as it grows could lead to some decay. And here's an example of the blade to the trunk side. I do a lot of my pruning late winter, depending on variety, but you know, a lot of the flowering crabs, fruiting apples, shade trees you can do late winter, early spring. You know, the upside is you can see the canopy, all the leaves are off the tree, so you can get a good clear picture and definition of the tree canopy. And you might say, well, how can you tell, you know, if a limb is dead limb without any leaves? You'll be able to tell. It's pretty. You'll look for peeling bark, snapped off tips, mushrooms. Mushrooms will be growing on decay. If there's any decay in the branch, it means that it's not surviving or needs to be pruned off. So this is that same property up to college. We had an ice storm, and a few of the original trees were broken by the heavy ice. We had over 3/4 of an inch of ice on the trees, and some failed. So this was a replacement. So I'm just showing this as an example. And I only prune trees for 1 year. And that's really as long as you need to stake them. Because you want to have that tree, when it does get blown in the wind, believe it or not, that little bit of motion, the tree's reaction is to set its roots. So we only stake for 1 year after planting, then remove the stakes. So this is one of the mature ones. This was the one that had the fruit on it. And you can see when this tree was younger, we raised the canopy, and you can see where the cambium is growing over. And I'm sure by now, this was probably 15 years ago, that these have all compartmentalized and sealed over. And that's mature size for that tree. So once you do the pruning in the early stages, pretty much done pruning it through the rest of its life. This is a flowering crabapple. There's over 347 varieties of flowering crabs. This one is spring snow. It is a fruitless variety. So ornamental crabs, the fruit is not edible, but the birds do find it to be a late winter food source. But this variety here does not fruit. You want to keep that in mind if you're fruiting Oh, excuse me, I got the wrong variety there. So I think that's a Donald Wyman, which obviously does fruit. My bad. So this tree was probably in the ground 8 or 9 years. So our smaller shrubs had grown up, so we just went through and took some of the lower limbs, scaffolding limbs off to raise the crown. Talk a little bit about weeping trees. This is a weeping snow fountain cherry. One of my favorite weepers. And you know, that's the true form of a weeping tree. It should cascade to the ground and have an open canopy. This is the picture I had shown earlier. This is a weeping mulberry. Again, never been pruned, so it's kind of a gnarly mess, but the upright growth is a genetic form of the original mulberry tree, which wants to grow upright. So quite a bit of pruning. You can bring a tree like this back. You cannot do it all at once. You would do it over a 3-year period. You know, start with the upright growth and then slowly thin out the canopy. This is a weeping katsura. Again, nice cascading tree, open canopy, and properly pruned. This is a weeping crab. I inherited this tree when I was working on the grounds of the School for the Deaf in Rome. Before I came on, they were shearing it with a head shear. So it took about 3 years to get back to good form. You can see here where I had to make some heavy cuts to open up the canopy. Those probably will not compartmentalize only because of the positioning of the branches, but they may grow over and you might have some slight decay, but crabapple and fruiting apple trees in this form could survive with some decay. You can see some of the crossing branches. The new growth is red. We've pruned some of that out and cleaned it up a little bit just to open up the canopy. Here's one of our cuts that we got probably 80% right, but eventually that cambium will connect and grow over and seal that. Let's see, we have a question and answer there. It's from Jeanette. How do you decide which branches to prune? Okay, so I'm going to answer that, and hopefully I think she can hear me. So you're going to prune anything that's rubbing, anything that is irregular growth, like growing straight up, and any dead branches, and branches that really do not look natural. And after a while, you'll get the hang of it, and you just want to thin that canopy right out so you get good airflow. I hope that answered your question. Just full disclosure, this seems like I'm just talking to myself in my office. And as usually I'm in an auditorium with, you know, anywhere from 50 to 80 people. I did a lecture once with 137, and I do miss the human interaction. But I do hope that this is educational for you and you guys are picking up some helpful tips here.
Mike, you've got 46 people listening and you're doing a great job.
Oh, thank you, Linda. Thank you. Okay. So when you're also pruning this time of year, that is a gypsy moth, eastern tent caterpillar egg mass. So I've seen quite a few this winter on shade trees, mainly maples and oaks, and on fruiting or flowering crabs. If you do have large maples and oaks on your property, go out and look, and it looks like a piece of wool on the bark. And the best thing to do right now is to go out with a broom or with your hands, however you can reach them, and just rub them off the tree. Because each little nest like this contains about 200 to 300 tent caterpillars. So they're saying it's going to be a bad year. I mean, and it's cyclic. Every 10 to 15 years we'll have a bad year. One year I remember it was so bad, and I think Holly brought in a fellow from, I think it was from Stittville. He had his own crop duster, and he had the new technology at that time with the GPS tracking, and he was able to spray up to as small as a 1/4 acre property from the air. And here in Clinton, we had one neighborhood where they were so overrun by tent caterpillars that cars were sliding off the roads in the neighborhood. That's how thick the coverage was. So they actually had hired him, and he used a non-invasive quote unquote pesticide that it was consumed by the caterpillars and messed with their digestive system and pretty much blew their stomachs up. But they say it's going to be a bad year. Let's see, Linda has a question. Are there any egg masses that are beneficial for beneficial insects, or is it hard rule remove all egg masses? Well, I've never claimed to be an entomologist, but it's a tough question. I'm sure there are some, but usually they're not as how do I put it, upfront and in your face like these egg masses are. Like ladybug egg masses, never seen one. They're inconspicuous, they're hidden. But these are the ones that I tend to see this year more than in the past. Okay, Martha asked how to prune evergreens, and that is a section of the lecture. So we'll get to that, Martha, in about 5 minutes or so. Okay, the number one abused weeping ornamental tree. Wait for it. Oh, there we go. The weeping cherry, or not. So this weeping cherry was sheared so bad that to me it looks like a Q-tip. Instead of growing it to its natural cascading free form, it would fill this palette beautifully. By palette, I mean the brick wall. But a lot of these landscape maintenance companies, they just come in with the gas-powered head shears and zip, zip, zip. And in reality, they can make just as much profit if they hand prune and do it the right way. There are some who do. There are some who just Don't know, but I'm guessing this is the case here. Here is the same property, and this is a weeping mulberry, and everyone says, can I have one of those umbrella trees? Now, this is what everyone calls an umbrella tree. In reality, there is no umbrella tree listed in any publications. There's a Japanese umbrella tree, which is an evergreen. It has an evergreen form, and the reason why they call it an umbrella tree is when you take the needle bundles and turn it upside down, it looks like an umbrella. So there really isn't, this is just from shearing, they'll shear to look like an umbrella, which is pretty much, detrimental to the tree. You can see all the gnarly growth. We have a few Q&As here. Let's just take a quick look. Dale, I have a 30-year-old dwarf apple tree. I have developed black burnt like bark last spring. A large branch had apples the size of quarters. It died. Not positive if it's fire blight affected branches or 1/5 of the canopy. Should the whole tree be cut down or just prune attached branches? Well, if it is some sort of a blight, you should remove and replace just so that's not spread to the other trees. And a lot of these dwarf apple trees now, you can buy them at the nursery, 4 or 5-year-old trees that already have apples on them. So no longer will you have to wait, 5 or 7 years for it to fruit. So yeah, I would remove it, again, just so it doesn't affect the others or spread to the other trees, and just replace it. Okay, Al wants to know, what is the strategy for trimming or pruning an apple tree that has gotten too tall? Okay, Al, and the about another 5 minutes, we'll get into another part of the program where I do show how to prune apple trees, and I hope that'll answer your question. Amy, loving this, thank you so much. I have a mature flowering crab apple. Will it ever stop growing water suckers? It puts out a lot every year, and I do trim them out. Also, is there any way to prevent suckers from growing from the base roots? Okay, so back in the 70s, early 80s, all the varieties of crab trees that they were selling were prone to suckering. The newer varieties are suckerless flowering crabs. But if you do get suckers or water sprouts, you want to prune those after flowering and midsummer. If you prune them now, wherever you prune them, chances are you'll have another one develop through this growing season. So you pretty much want to prune those after the tree has put out all of its energy to push out growth and start fruit, and remove those suckers at that point. Not saying that you won't have a few more come back, but you'll definitely have less. Valerie wants to know, why do my fruit trees, plum and pear trunks, split? Chances are, Valerie, that in the early stages when the trees were young, they were allowed to develop a double leader. So they weren't pruned to a single leader. And now if you're talking about the bark splitting, sometimes that is also caused by frost, by the freezing and thawing of the thin canopy, because plum and pear have very thin canopy bark. This time of year, like tomorrow, it's going to be 70, 75. Then next week, it's back down in the 30s. So you get that constant freezing and thawing, that could cause some of that too. So Al wants to know, how do you prune a rose of Sharon that has gotten too tall and that has lots of suckers growing around the main tree? So if it's a tree form with a single stem, you can reduce it back pretty hard. Rose of Sharon takes a very hard pruning and will come back. If it's a multi-stemmed and it's way out of shape, you can literally prune it right back down to the ground. But again, Rose of Sharon is a very brittle tree or shrub. So if you've gotten a lot of top growth, you can prune that way back. Roseanne inherited 3 burning bushes in her main foundation planting. They are very overgrown. Besides removing them, can I cut them back to the ground? Or is there a series of cuts that I have to do over time? Good to see you again, Mike. Great lecture. Well, thank you, Roseanne. And yes, you can cut those back to the ground. Burning bush has a very thick, massive root system. So when you do cut those down, it's going to be pushing out new growth like you wouldn't believe. Like the picture that we showed earlier, it's called rejuvenation pruning. They will definitely come back. All right, so back to our, can I have one of those umbrella trees? So again, this is a weeping cherry that was topped. That looked lovely. Again, the best prune would have been right at the base of the tree. Remove it and plant something that's going to be more suitable. Again, this is the proper weeping cherry. How it should grow: open canopy, draping on the ground. Again, another weeping cherry. Very bad pruning job. And, you know, to me, when I first saw this tree, I just couldn't get this vision out of my head. Because it kind of does looks like a stalk of broccoli. But again, that tree was topped. You can see the topping cuts and just, you know, not very attractive. You know, and trees should be attractive during the winter, the branch form. If you guys ever get a chance, visit the Hamilton College campus during the winter. They have a self walking tour of their on-campus arboretum, and a lot of the European beech, weeping, cutleaf fern beech are beautiful in the winter. They have beautiful forms to them that are very attractive. So you really would want to keep an open canopy so it's more attractive. And back to this, let me just take a look here. I got another question. Let's see. So Al wants to know, what is the strategy for trimming or pruning an apple tree that's gotten too tall? We're going to talk about that, Amy. Valerie, Al.
Mike, you might want to save the questions till the end, because I think you're going to cover some of these things, and then we can kind of address them at the end. Yeah. Yeah,
and I got 10 minutes till 8. So
yeah.
Okay. Yep. Okay, so this is the snow or the Canadian cloud cherry that's infested with black knot. Again, remove that tree. And the thing is, you know, they probably trim this and then didn't disinfect their shears. And so they're spreading that to the next tree. If there's another cherry in the vicinity they're pruning, but if you don't disinfect your shears, you will spread that. There's just a closer look. You can see the black knot in the tree. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about flowering shrubs. This is a limelight hydrangea. Hydrangeas are very popular. We'll talk about how to prune those. there's two basic cuts used for shrub pruning. There's a thinning or renewal, that is removing a stem back to its point of origin, which provides a more natural growth form of the plants, then removing about 1/3 of the old wood or canes, generally the least invigorating type of cut. So that's a thinning or renewal cut. Then a heading cut, unlike a top cut, reduces overall height and size. You're going to cut it back to an emerging bud or side branch, where a topping cut is just a random cut anywhere at the top. Heading cut also make your cuts at random length to help retain natural appearance, and usually forces lower dormant buds to sprout. So in the center, that is a Wine and Roses 9 bark. And you've got some knockout roses there. So talk a little bit about the knockout roses. I keep mine up during the winter because, again, I like the winter attraction. The dried flowers through the winter season, to me, looks very nice. And you have some substance there. The worst back in the 80s, we used to wrap everything in burlap. But here's another benefit. So now spring emerges, you can see where your new growth is coming. You're going to prune down to the green new growth for the new season. You can see where I'm making my cut there, just above a new bud. And that's what your roses should look like after you've pruned them in the spring. That's for the knockout roses, which again are very popular. And again, the look during the winter. This is a Pinky Winky hydrangea. It's a paniculata variety. The paniculata variety will flower on new wood. Again, I don't prune mine. Well, actually, I don't prune mine. My wife did them this year for me. She just did a little pruning the other day on our hydrangeas. But like I said, I like to leave the dried flowers up through the winter. So rejuvenation pruning, Roseanne, you'll do that with your burning bush. You can see here these hard cuts. This was a double file viburnum growing on the side of my house. Back in 2015, we had a flood, and I had 5 feet of water in my basement, and the fire department needed to get in their big pump hose, and the shrub was in the way. So I literally got my chainsaw out and cut it to the ground because they had to get into that window. And full disclosure, since I've redone the foundation and painted it, looks a little nicer. But yeah, that's 2 years later from just cutting that viburnum right back to the ground. So that's the growth 2 years later. That's called a rejuvenation prune. You can do the same thing with red twig dogwood. Red twig dogwood gets old and stale, which means, you know, the branches, as they get older, they get brown. The new growth is red. I plant it for the winter color. So every couple, 3-4 years, I just go through, flush cut it to the ground, and you get this brilliant red growth that comes back. And you can see those hard cuts that I had made. This was a flowering quince. I inherited at the School for the Deaf. They were just shearing it over the years, not much fruit or flower on them. So again, we rejuvenate them, cut them right back to the ground in the early spring, and that's the that current year's growth. So a few rules of thumb: know your bloom time. Know when your plants are going to bloom. Does it bloom on old wood or new wood? Trees and shrubs that flower before the end of June should be pruned immediately after they're done flowering. Those that flower after the end of June should be pruned in late winter or early spring before growth starts. So pruning hydrangeas. So Endless Summer is a macrophylla variety. Oak leaf hydrangea, quercifolia. So these hydrangeas should be pruned after they're flowering done flowering, start to fade in the late summer. You can see example there, how those are pruned. And then your hydrangea, your paniculata variety, or your arboreans. So the panicle or paniculata varieties are the limelights, the pinky winky, the strawberry and vanilla. It's a lot of the ones that you see in the nurseries that are full of color. And again, your tag is going to, most shrubs now do come with tags that will tell you when to prune. But these you're gonna cut these shrubs back in late winter, which is now, before new growth begins. I was telling Linda earlier, I've been getting a ton of phone calls for work. Some woman wanted me to put her landscape in the second week of April. And I called her, I said, second week of April here, it's still winter. So, we don't want to rush things. But on the left is before pruning, on the right is after pruning. So that is what you're looking to achieve when you're trying to thin out a shrub. Formal hedge on the left, before and after. Informal, before and after. A correct way to prune a hedge: thin at the top, narrow at the bottom, so sunlight gets on the whole plant, as opposed to wide at the top, narrow at the bottom, because you'll shade out and kill out the lower part. So evergreens. Let's talk a little bit about evergreens. So with evergreens, you're going to pinch the new candle growth back to 50%. So what I mean by new candle growth, it's the new growth that comes out to the end of the branch. It's very soft at that point, almost rubbery feeling, but you're just going to pinch that off. Then you're going to selectively hand prune to thin, which would be junipers, which is the lower right hand side of this picture. If you are shearing, just be careful not to cut into the dead zone, and that's the area where no sun gets in and shades out the plant. So hedges, again, you want it narrow at the top and wide at the bottom. So pretty much the opposite of what you have here. So you can see this one where it's wide at the top, full of foliage and leaves, and then narrow at the bottom. It's thinner because it's not getting the sunlight. And this is privet, by the way. In privet, you can literally rejuvenate it, cut it right back to the ground, and you'll get 2 to 3 feet of new growth the year. If you cut it back in the late winter, you'll get 2 to 3 feet of new growth that growing season. Here's a person who did that same hedge. I follow that hedge. It's in my neighborhood. But they rejuvenated it. But you want to make sure that you make your cuts no bigger than 4 inches in level. Because, God forbid someone trips on that sidewalk and basically you have spears sticking up out of the ground here. Someone could get injured. But, you want to keep them uniform to the highest about 4 inches. This is some honeysuckle that, again, just cut it right back to the ground. Cutting it in half is unsightly. And honeysuckle grows like a weed. In some areas, it is a weed. So, again, just cut it back to the ground and get some nice uniform growth that you can manage. You can see where they made their cuts. This is an evergreen hedge. Apparently they only had a 6-foot ladder. But then the following year I drove by and they must have got a bigger ladder and they just cut it in half, which you can do. You'll have a little bald spot on the top, but eventually it will grow and fill in. But now they can manage it. An espalier is a form of pruning developed in Europe because they had small yards, but they wanted fruit trees, so they would train them to grow against a wall. And this is a Granny Smith fruiting espalier. They take a lot of work. You do have to, you see the wire holding it up. They're high maintenance, but definitely worth it. This is a flowering espalier. It's an ornamental crab that we did in the garden. So fruit trees. So if anybody lives around an orchard, you see how, I mean, they prune them. They look like, you know, primitive creatures. But, you know, what they're doing is they're removing all of the new growth to the old wood, because fruit trees will fruit on old wood. So they go through and they are pretty much, so someone asked earlier, I have an older fruit tree, you know, can I prune it back pretty hard? You can take a chainsaw and take some hard cuts. Fruiting apple trees will survive with decay, and the decay is not as damaging because these trees are small. You don't have big limbs that are going to come down on houses, and trees will survive with a 90% decay, because most of that decay is the heartwood, which doesn't store energy, doesn't have anything to do with growing the fruit. As we know, it's the outer layer with the xylem and phloem channels that support life and provide water and nutrients to the tree. So you can get pretty harsh. Cornell does have a book called The Homeowner's Guide to Growing Fruit at Home, and you can purchase that at, or you can actually just print out some pages from it on gardening.cornell.edu. And if you go to that website, you can just type in Homeowner's Guide to Growing Fruit at Home, and it's a great publication. I hope that answered your question. So a little bit about tools of the trade. So personal protective equipment, you know, gloves, glasses, ear protection if you're using power equipment. So the gloves will at least save that piece of the finger that you cut off in a contained compartment, so you can carry it with you to get sewn back on. But just kidding there. But gloves will save you from getting scratches, and if you're digging your hand and rubbing against a dead branch. But yeah, definitely gloves, glasses, you know, eyes and ears, and glove protection. So the top is called an anvil pruner, which we don't use anymore. So the anvil pruners crushed the branch. So you had one blade that came down on a straight bar, and I call it a cut crush cutting. But the bypass pruners is what you want. That's a pair of Felco's. I don't endorse, I'm not a paid endorsee of Felco, but they do make some of the best hand pruners. They make them for small hands. They make them for left-handed people. They make them where the handle rotates, so it's less fatigue. But they cost a little more, but they're worth it. And they come in red handles, so when you lose them in a brush pile, they're easier to find, which I have in the past. So basically, besides the Felco's, this is what, you know, a nice little handsaw, pair of hand shears, and these Corona loppers you use, even though they're anvil, you use those when you're doing your rejuvenation pruning. Say you're cutting a privet hedge back, because the long handle is going to give you better leverage where you'll be able to cut that. Just know your limitations, you know, what tool. So with the loppers, you're probably looking at, you know, up to an inch in diameter. Anything bigger, I would use a handsaw, just so you don't get fatigued. But, you know, this is basically all the average homeowner would need. You know, a good long pair handled loppers, a folding saw, and a pair of bypass hand clippers. I'll leave these tools to the professional. You know, again, if you are going to use them, you know, helmets and ear protection and eye protection. So this is one of my favorite slides. Where should we plant these Arbor Day trees? So it's near a friend of mine's home. 5 evergreens. That's all I could think of. They got 5 trees in the mail when they joined the Arbor Day Foundation, and they planted them behind their garage, and it's slowly rotting the wood behind the garage. And at some point, they're just going to get too big. So again, make sure you put the right tree in the right place. And be easy on NIMO. Chances are the power lines were there before the tree. So if you do have a tree on your property that looks like this, NIMO will be more than happy to take it down. If it's a tree that's owned by the village or the city, they'll take it down and they'll give you, I think it's $65 towards the purchase of a new tree. And this is just, you're going to have limbs falling out of it. So better to remove it and replace with something that's going to grow under the power lines. Or you can do this if you live in Florida. You can paint the trunks of your trees to match your home. I saw this while down on vacation down there. Some people ask, well, isn't that for insect control? And no, not really. They just thought they'd paint them to, match the house. But it's not detrimental. You can see the oranges still on the trees. Bonsai is a form of therapeutic pruning. I was fortunate to see the bonsai display at the Brooklyn Botanical Garden. That's where I took this photo. This bonsai tree was 80 years old. They had a couple of bonsais there that were over 100. Very, very cool. And this form of pruning, you root prune also. So very intense. And here, this woman hired this guy to prune her tree, and things didn't go too well. This might be the same guy. And believe me, I've seen some of this in person. And I mean, unfortunately, you can, go on YouTube and Google tree takedowns gone bad, and there's just one right after the other. But, leave this kind of work to the professionals, and if you do need a professional, check their credentials, call more than one. It would be nice if they were a certified arborist, or they had certified arborists on staff, because they're held to a higher standard. To stay a certified arborist, you need to acquire 30 continuing education credits every 3 years to keep your certification. So they're up on the latest and greatest pruning techniques and tree care operations. But you always get 3 estimates, and make sure you're hiring a qualified professional. And trees are resilient. I hunt in the Adirondacks, and I don't call it hunting, I call it hiking, because I've taken 1 trophy deer in 21 years. But I see a lot of this. This was in the deep woods near the Blue Mountain region, and they are resilient. This little seedling, germinated in the crevice of this rock and reached for, the water and reached for the soil and anchored in. And of course it struck me because it looks like an eagle's talon, coming down to pick up this rock and fly off with it. But trees are very, very resilient. And that's where I've seen a lot of, natural pruning taking place, like SHIGO'S saw in the woods, where trees just die back, fall off, and heal themselves over. Thanks for attending. This is some of my information. That's the best way to get a hold of me. If you have questions or if you need any consulting or whatnot, is the evergreenlandscapelighting.com. That's my website, and there's my email address. You can either email me through the website or at the email address. My formal education was in landscape design. I went to Morrisville College. But when I worked at Hamilton for 20 years, I didn't get to do any of that. So I've always had a landscape design business and became a certified arborist. I hate to say it, close to 30 years ago. But I think I became certified at 17. I can't remember what the age was, but yeah, let's see. So Linda, do I have some time for questions?
Well, we are going to do a poll first before we move into the questions. Thank you, Mike.
Good job.
Thank you.
And and I want to mention he's going to be coming back on Wednesday, April 21st to talk about tree selection. So tune into that class on Wednesday the 21st at 7 p.m. And our poll, we're going to put it up now and you can answer the questions, please. Oh, I had to launch it. Sorry. Launch poll.
Oh, that was fast. So when I look at that one question, are you new to pruning? I was thinking, I'm not necessarily, but I learned some things tonight, Mike.
Well, good.
What I'm doing wrong and what I need to know.
Yeah. And, I was there with you when I started out. I would take a little bit off of a limb, step back, take a little bit more off, and then end up taking the whole limb, because I realized, that limb is too low, but, you're just hesitant because you can't glue them back on,
That's true.
Yeah. But, a lot of shrubs are pretty forgiving. They do come back. Some of the evergreen shrubs are not. That's why you have to selectively hand prune them, and be a little more. And again, it goes back to putting the right, don't plant a hemlock on your foundation. If you want an evergreen that's going to grow to 6 feet, plant a dwarf arborvitae or a dwarf upright juniper. Through breeding, there are just so many new dwarf varieties that are great because, who wants to be a slave to their yard? I mean, then again, perennial gardening is very therapeutic. If that's your thing, but especially last year, through the pandemic, I have friends I went to college with who have nurseries, and they had the best year ever in their careers with landscaping. They sold out their annuals and perennials before June. That never happened. They usually throw them in the compost pile in July.
Right, it was a big year. And by the way, just tell your neighbors to cut the trees. It's past time, okay?
Right.
Okay. So how did the poll turn out, Holly?
We did. Are you new to pruning? 44%. 56 said no. Did you learn something new? Learn something tonight that you did not know about pruning? 100% answered that. Will you share with others some of the pruning tools that you learned this evening? And 97% said yes. And thank you for doing the poll. And I will close out.
All right. And then I just wanted to give this one question to Mike because it showed up on the chat, and it's kind of an interesting question. It says, my understanding of compartmentalization involves the tree's reaction to an open wound by sending preserving lignins or chemicals to the area to prevent rot. Then the tree has time to heal over with expanding cambium and new bark. Can you clarify? How's that one for a mouthful, Mike?
Yeah, can you repeat that again?
Yeah, okay, sure. I just put it down, Mike. So they're saying, did you talk about compartmentalization?
Compartmentalization, yes.
Yep. Yes, okay. So they're just saying the open wound, the tree reacts to the open wound.
Right.
Sending preservative chemicals from the tree to that area to prevent rot. And then it's time to heal over. And
right.
yeah, and then so I don't know what cambium is. So it says it with expanding cambium and new bark. It doesn't always get bark on it though, does it, on a wound?
Right. So some wounds will heal, and some wounds, what happens is called ram's heading, where the cambium is growing, but it curls inward and never really compartmentalizes that wound. So it is a give and take depending on how that wound happens. But yes, with all wounds or pruning cuts, the tree does respond. But to the point of compartmentalization, it has to be a proper cut where it's incidental or accidental. It's not going to totally compartmentalize depending on the situation.
Mm-hmm. And another person wants to know, and then there's just a few on the question and answer, when and how do I prune my coral honeysuckle?
Okay, so that's a spring bloomer. Mm-hmm. So you're going to prune that after blooming. If it's really overgrown, you can prune it hard. I mean, you can cut it back to a foot. Usually the honeysuckle doesn't look good when it's thinned out because it'll look leggy. So you have to really go all in and cut it right back to the ground and just let it rejuvenate.
It gets fuller. Yeah.
Right. And then I have a couple here on the Q&A. Valerie, let's see. I will have to get off. Well, this woman said, I will have to get off before you're finished. Would love it if you could email me the answer to my question about my weeping cherry. So she said her weeping cherry was never pruned at drapes, but also has middle branches that grow up. Is it too late to prune? So cherries are spring bloomers. So you're going to prune after bloom. So let it bloom and then prune those upright branches afterwards. Then Valerie wants to know, she's grown a Myers lemon tree indoors.
Oh, yeah.
This is the first year, and it has flowers that give off a wonderful aroma with 3 green lemons. Do I prune this as well? I would say no.
Okay, it's tropical.
Only because, but the one thing I do know is you have to be aware of mealybugs with the lemon trees. Mealybugs look like cotton. They're little tiny white cottony looking things. I did have a client who also grew lemon trees indoors, and they were overcome with mealybugs. So you can treat those with a dormant oil or a fine oil spray. But and I guess you prune it. I mean, they're not going to be vigorous growers from what I'm telling, but pretty much would prune it in the same fashion as a deciduous tree. So
before you go on, I just want to say, because some people are getting off, I will email everyone tomorrow the link to the YouTube channel with this whole talk and all of the questions on it. So if you have to go, you can go back and listen to this, or, move yourself ahead to the questions and hear the answers. So go ahead.
Great. So Kate wants to know, when do you cut back the apple tree? Right now. Right now is the time. Take all the new growth off, clean out any irregular branches and get some good form to it. How do you disinfect your tools? So you're just going to do a mild bleach solution, and you're going to dip your pruner into the solution after every cut. And she also wants to know, if you prune the top of hemlocks, will they grow bushier? Yes and no. So you have to trim the whole plant to have it grow bushier. You could selectively prune out the top to another branch. And then if you're trying to create a hedge, you would have to shear it to get that thick growth. She also wants to know, the hemlocks are in the backyard, not near the house. Okay, good. So that's how you prune those. And then Dale says he has a spruce tree which seems to have bottom branches dying each year. Should I prune them or leave them as birds perch in them often. So probably what you have going on is a disease of spruce, which
that's what I'm thinking.
Which is happening all over. It's called needle cast of spruce. So, and then the other thing that kind of masks as needle cast, if your spruce tree is growing in the shade, spruce branches will die in the shade. So if that's going on, that happens also. But if you do have needle cast, what I did with my spruce tree a few years back, when I learned about this coming down the pike, it spreads from the bottom up. So I was proactive and I pruned my spruce tree up about 8 feet just to stop the spread. So I pruned it up to healthy branches. It has slowed it down. My tree's probably 50 feet tall. And it is a trophy piece for the house. It's a beautiful tree in a beautiful spot. So I wanted to try to preserve it as much as I could. So I was just proactive and I did limb up the bottom branches. So, but yeah, look up needle cast of spruce, Dale. So, and
we'll have to have you come back and do something on diseases and pests, but that's a huge topic.
Yeah,
cover. But we get a lot of calls on things like that. So yeah. All right, Mike, you did such a
thank you.
Yeah. So I'm just going to go through the chat here real quick, make sure there's no answers in there. How do you prune evergreens? We went through that. She has a weeping cherry that wasn't ever pruned. It hangs nicely. We talked about that. Harry talked about the compartmentalization.
They can always call the office too, and I'll try as much as possible, or at least get them to the information that they may need.
Yes. Linda's at our front desk, so she answers the phone.
Yes, we were very busy today because it's warm and everybody wants to get going.
All right. So that's it.
Okay. Thank you, Mike.
All right, ladies, you have a good night.
And thank you for attending. Have a good
everyone,
night.
And I'll get that link to everybody tomorrow.
All righty.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Bye-bye.